Okay, I haven't made one of these Poetics of Thought videos for a while because I've been doing other things. I've been decorating my kitchen and making videos on my other channel and what have you. And I've had a lot of work to do here. But I'm trying to kind of re-enter that project really. And what I want to do is rather than work from a script, I want to try to rehearse rehearse some of the ideas I want to move forward into. Probably not directly following on from the last piece I made to do with subjectivity, although it's related to that. I think I need to kind of flesh out some of the ideas first, and then perhaps do some backfilling later on. But what I want to move into is a discussion about what I see as the principal sets of metaphors that are used to articulate different kinds of knowledge. And I want to use the objective-subjective distinction as a kind of primary axis to build a set of metaphorical distinctions around, just because I think it's the clearest, really. And what I want to argue is that objective knowledge and subjective knowledge are, I mean, they're kind of convenient placeholders for particular accumulations of metaphorical entailments. And those metaphorical entailments are quite specific, and they're quite coherent, and they relate to one another quite coherently, I think, and that relationship is ultimately grounded in our embodiment and the kind of sensory motor inheritance that I've talked about in previous videos and on previous postings on the blog. So what I want to do now is just run through some of those metaphorical ideas and some of the entailments which flow out of that in relation to objectivity and subjectivity. And then the next few videos, what I want to try to do is to run some case studies of different epistemologies, different knowledge systems through those metaphors, just to kind of test the stability, to see if there is, if they are coherent, if it does kind of make sense. The primary metaphors I want to talk about are metaphors of sensory modality, metaphors of space, particularly proximity and distance, and metaphors of objects, particularly the substantial qualities that objects have, things like what they're made of, what their properties are. So space, sensory modality and objects. And these are the things I've talked about before in relation to that Mark Johnson quote. So if I can just clarify that by talking about what I consider to be a kind of the metaphors which orient around what might be considered a piece of prototypical objective knowledge. And I've talked about prototypical objects in the past, so I'm kind of referring back to that. What I consider to be prototypical knowledge objects and what I consider to be prototypical prototypical objective knowledge entities, and what I might be considered prototypical subjective knowledge entities. I have to be careful of my language here, because if I keep using the word object, it gets confusing. So I'll use various words like entity. So what I'm saying is that there are particular entities of knowledge which might be considered prototypically objective, and there's a particular set of metaphors which define that and express that condition, and then there's other one for subjective. Okay. So objective knowledge, I would say, in terms of space and proximity, we express and indeed conceive of objective knowledge as being placed at some distance from us, at some distance from the body, and crucially separated from, detached from the body, in no contact with the body at all, out there in space. Just a few words about that space. I would also say that that space has particular qualities, but I'll talk about those in a sec. In terms of the sensory modality that one approaches prototypical objective knowledge, the primary sensory modality is sight. So we conceive of prototypical objective knowledge entities as visual objects, and there are entailments of vision and space which build into that. So along with a prototypical objective knowledge entity being visual, it is required that the space is clear, that there be sufficient illumination, in other words there is the presence of light, There is no obscuring clouds or shadows or vapours in the way. Okay, so sensory modality is sight. Spatial relationship is one of separateness and distance, and the qualities of the space are to do with illumination and clarity. In terms of the substantial quality of that knowledge entity, I think I would say that we tend to think of it and express it in terms of solidity, of robustness, of weight, of persistence over time, of coherence, of boundedness, and of kind of unity. So a prototypical knowledge object is a kind of solid, is experienced and conceptualized as a kind of solid object which has weight and solidity and a really clearly bounded edge. That's a kind of prototypical knowledge entity in terms of objective knowledge. So I'll claim at least. Okay, if I can move on from that and contrast that with what I'm seeing as prototypical subjective knowledge entities, and as you might guess, there's a completely opposite. In terms of space and proximity, a prototypical subjective knowledge entity is conceived as being very, very proximal. It's very close to the body, possibly even inside the body. And the gesture I'm making here is pretty much indicative of that. When we talk about subjective knowledge, it's very likely that we'll make this kind of gesture to indicate that the location of that knowledge is inside ourselves. So it's conceived of as being very proximal, not distanced, not detached. And again, there's some entailments to do with that space, which I'll talk about. The sensory modality for subjective knowledge tends not to be visual. We don't talk about seeing visual this kind of knowledge. It might be gustatory. We might talk about it in terms of taste, and not just talk about it, but conceive of it in terms of taste, or possibly in terms of smell. But I would say the primary modality for accessing subjective knowledge entities would be tactile, the feeling, and we use words like feelings, or something like proprioception, that set of very kind of central embodied feelings which tell us where we are in space. So we might talk about being moved or feeling under pressure. Those kinds of expressions, which are ultimately proprioceptive or tactile expressions, might be used in the expression of and also in the conception of prototypical subjective knowledge entities. So spatially it's proximal, sensory modality is taste, smell, and primarily touch. And in terms of the objective or the substantial qualities of that entity, it's not solid. It's likely to be very friable or very fractured. It will not have clearly bounded edges. It'll be evanescent and fuzzy. In terms of its weight, it's likely to be either weightless or insubstantial in terms of its weight. We might even talk about it being difficult to grasp, or we might talk about it slipping through our fingers. So it has that almost liquidy or almost gaseous quality. It's likely to feel less robust and feel less likely to persist over time or not to change over time. It is likely to feel like it will change quite easily and could easily evaporate. We get the sense that it could easily evaporate if it's not handled in very careful ways. And just to return to these qualities, these spatial qualities, in contrast with the what I've called the prototypical knowledge entity, which exists out there in clearly lit space. It's a clear space with illumination. Subjective knowledge entities might be conceived of either as in a dark space or in a confused and tangled space, or in a space which is shadowed and occupied and permeated by other kinds of entities and forces. So I think we might be more likely to use those kinds of expressions in talking about prototypical subjective knowledge entities, and those kinds of thoughts and those kinds of ideas, I think, would inform our understanding of what that is. Okay, I've probably talked too long. What I'm saying here is this, is that in terms of the difference between prototypical and prototypical subjective and prototypical objective knowledge entities, there are some distinctions to be made, and those distinctions play out in terms of a set of metaphors. Metaphors of sensory modality, metaphors of space in terms of distance and proximity, and metaphors of substantial quality. And what's also probably just worth mentioning before I close is that these things aren't separate. There is a coherence across those different metaphor groups. And what I want to do in the next few videos, as I say, is to play out some epistemologies of knowledge to see how they use those metaphors and to see if there is a coherence. Okay, thanks very much indeed for listening.